By the time anyone in Millbrook Hollow understood why the owls had come, the rats were already gone. Not thinned out, not reduced, gone. Grain bins that had rattled with the scratching of 1,000 tiny feet every night for 2 years had gone completely silent. The feed store owner would later say he drove past the Bramwell place 3 times just to make sure he had the right farm. Fields that had been chewed to stubble at the roots stood full and undisturbed. Somebody's teenage son swore he saw a shape glide low over the north pasture at dusk, wide and silent as a held breath, and then it was gone before he could point it out to anyone. Nobody could explain it, not right away. All anyone knew was that 18 months earlier, a 41-year-old dairy and grain farmer named Elias Bramwell had done something that made half the county think he'd lost his mind. He stopped buying poison. And he started building birdhouses. If you've ever been laughed at for trying something different, this story is for you. Subscribe, like this video, and tell us where you're watching from. You never know, the next idea everyone doubts might be the one that changes everything. Bramwell Fields sat on 160 acres of rolling clay loam soil outside a small town called Corin's Bend, the kind of place where the feed store doubled as the news desk and everyone knew whose truck was parked where before breakfast. Elias had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Bramwells had worked that dirt, and by the time it reached Elias, the farm was carrying more debt than it had ever carried grain. He was not a sentimental man, not outwardly, but he kept his grandfather's hand plow bolted to the wall of the equipment shed, rusted and useless, because taking it down felt like giving something up. His wife, Dana, ran the books and the vegetable stand at the end of the drive. She had a way of making the numbers sound less frightening than they were, rounding down the bad news just enough to let both of them sleep at night. His daughter Meredith was 11, sharp as a tack, and spent her afternoons doing homework at the kitchen table while half listening to her parents talk in low, worried voices about numbers that didn't add up. Mornings on Bramwell Field started the same way they always had. Elias was up before the sun, boots crunching frost in the fall, mud in the spring, moving between the milking parlor and the grain bins with the kind of tired, practiced rhythm that only comes from doing something your whole life. The land itself was beautiful in a plain, unglamorous way, rolling fields hemmed by old hedgerows, a stand of oaks along the eastern boundary that had been there longer than any Bramwell had, a weathered red silo that had needed repainting for a decade. It was, in its own quiet way, everything Elias had. And lately, it felt like it was slipping through his fingers one invoice at a time. The rats had started as a nuisance. Every farm has rats, but 2 winters of mild weather and one careless neighbor's uncovered compost pile had turned a nuisance into an infestation that seemed to double every season. They got into the grain bins first, then the livestock feed, then the machine shed, where they chewed through wiring harnesses on 2 tractors in a single month, racking up repair bills Elias didn't have. Contamination reports from a regional co-op cost him a contract that had taken years to build. He tried everything: bait stations, snap traps by the dozen, a pest control contract that ate 1/3 of what little profit the farm made. For a while it seemed to work. Then the rats adapted, the way rats always do, and the numbers crept back up, worse than before. One night in early spring, Elias sat at the kitchen table with a stack of invoices and a cup of coffee gone cold, and Dana asked him quietly, "What happens if none of this works?" He didn't have an answer. The idea did not arrive dramatically. It arrived the way most good ideas do, quietly, almost by accident. Elias had gone to see Walt Kessler, a retired wildlife biologist in his late 70s, who lived at the edge of town and still kept bees out of stubbornness more than profit. Elias had gone hoping to buy a few jars of honey for Dana's stand. He left 2 hours later with something else entirely. Walt had spent 30 years studying barn owl populations before he retired, and when Elias mentioned the rats almost as an afterthought, Walt's eyes lit up in a way that surprised him. "You know, a single barn owl family can take down over 1,000 rodents in a season," Walt said, setting his mug down hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim. "Not because they're trying to help you, because that's just what they do. Nobody keeps a rat population in check better than the thing that's supposed to be eating it." Elias laughed, half out of politeness. "So what? I'm supposed to build birdhouses?" Walt didn't laugh back. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a water-stained pamphlet from the 1970s, its cover barely legible, titled "Natural Rodent Control Through Raptor Habitat Restoration." He pressed it into Elias's hands like it was something sacred. Nesting boxes, Walt said. Owls used to have places to raise young all over this valley. Old barns, hollow trees, dead snags, we've cleared most of it. Give them somewhere to nest, and they'll do the rest themselves. Elias took the pamphlet home mostly to be polite. He read it twice that night. Word travels fast in a town of 600 people, and word of what Elias was planning traveled faster than most. By the time the first owl box went up on a fence post near the east pasture, half of Corin's Bend already knew, and most of them thought it was the funniest thing they'd heard all year. At the feed store, a man named Roy Callahan leaned against the counter and said loud enough for the whole store to hear, "So instead of fixing the rats, you're building birdhouses?" Laughter followed him out the door. At the coffee shop on Main Street, Elias overheard two men he'd known his whole life debating whether he'd finally cracked under the pressure of the farm. Neither of them noticed he was standing 3 feet away. Or maybe they did and didn't care. His own brother-in-law made a joke about it at Sunday dinner that landed a little too sharp to laugh off. Dana squeezed Elias's hand under the table, but he saw the worry behind her smile. Even Meredith came home from school one day looking smaller than usual. "Some kids said Dad's building bird hotels because he's going broke," she said quietly. Elias didn't have a good answer for that either. Not yet. Cars slowed on the county road as they passed the farm, drivers craning their necks at the strange wooden boxes mounted on posts and fence lines, like something out of a fever dream. Kids pointed. A few people even stopped to ask, half joking, half concerned, if everything was all right. It wasn't the mockery itself that wore on Elias, it was the doubt creeping into his own house. He kept building anyway. Reclaimed lumber from an old collapsed barn on the property became his primary material, since new wood wasn't in the budget. He built after the evening milking was done, working by shop light and headlamp, long after Dana and Meredith had gone to bed. He read everything he could find on proper box dimensions, entrance hole sizes, mounting heights, and directional placement to avoid direct sun and prevailing wind. He climbed an old wooden extension ladder he'd patched with scrap boards, hauling boxes up into tree forks and along fence lines, his hands blistered and his back aching by the second month. Some nights Dana would find him still out there past midnight, breath fogging in the cold, driving screws by flashlight. "You don't have to do all of them tonight," she told him once. "I do," he said, "because tomorrow I'll think of a reason not to." By early summer, he'd built and mounted over 30 nesting boxes across the property, along fence lines, at the wood's edge, near the old grain silo, tucked into the eaves of the equipment shed. And then nothing happened. No owls came, no signs of life. Just 30 wooden boxes standing empty against the sky, silent reminders of the money and sleep he couldn't get back. The rats, meanwhile, didn't slow down at all. Weeks passed, then a month. The whispers around town grew louder, but so did something else. Small, strange details that Elias almost didn't trust himself to notice. One evening near the tree line, he found a scattering of soft gray feathers beneath an old oak, tucked into the grass like they'd fallen from nowhere. He picked one up and turned it over in his palm for a long time. A few nights later, an eerie, rasping call echoed across the fields just after dark. Not quite a hoot, more like a hiss carried on wind. Meredith heard it from her bedroom window and came downstairs wide-eyed, asking if it was a ghost. "I don't think so," Elias told her, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. Rats seemed to avoid the strip of field near the tree line, though Elias told himself it was probably coincidence. Coyotes, maybe. A shift in weather. One morning, strange oblong pellets appeared beneath one of the boxes near the old silo, compact, gray, and unlike anything he'd seen before. He didn't know yet that they were owl pellets, the undigested bones and fur of the very rodents plaguing his farm, compacted and cast aside like evidence at a crime scene. Something was happening, he just couldn't prove it yet. There were nights he stood at the edge of the tree line long after he should have gone inside, waiting for something he couldn't name. He told himself he was being foolish, chasing feathers in silence like a man looking for meaning in coincidence. But some part of him kept coming back out into the cold anyway. One dusk in late September, both Elias and Meredith swore they saw movement near the old oak, a shift in the shadows, a shape that didn't belong to any bird they recognized. But by the time either of them turned a flashlight toward it, there was nothing there at all. Meredith talked about it for days afterward, half thrilled and half spooked, asking her father over and over what he thought it might have been. "I don't know yet," he told her honestly, "but I think we're about to find out." Then, one gray October evening, he saw it. A pale shape dropped from the darkening sky and landed on the roof peak of the old grain silo, wide wings folding in slow motion, a heart-shaped white face turning to look directly at him before it launched silently back into the dusk. He stood frozen in the yard for a full minute after it vanished. Winter arrived hard and early that year, and with it, doubt crept back in. The owl, if it had even been real, some nights Elias wondered, never seemed to return to that same box. No droppings, no feathers, just silence and cold and 30 empty wooden houses gathering frost. Elias nearly gave up on the whole idea more than once that winter. The financial pressure hadn't eased. If anything, a slow month at the co-op made things worse. Dana never said, "I told you so," but the exhaustion on her face some nights said enough. Then, in late February, everything changed. A pair of barn owls took up residence in the box nearest the old silo, the same one where he'd seen that first pale shape months before. He noticed the signs before he saw the birds themselves. Fresh pellets accumulating steadily beneath the box, feathers caught on the rough wood at the entrance hole, faint scratching sounds after dark. He didn't celebrate, not yet. A late-season ice storm rolled through in early March, and Elias spent 2 sleepless nights worrying the box wouldn't hold, that the pair would abandon the nest before eggs were even laid. A red-tailed hawk began circling the property with unusual persistence, likely drawn by the same rodent activity, and Elias found himself standing guard at dusk more nights than he could count, half hoping, half dreading what he might see. The eggs came in mid-March, 5 of them, pale and fragile, glimpsed briefly when Walt Kessler came out to help Elias check the box with a mirror pole, both men holding their breath. "Now we wait," Walt said. In April, the eggs hatched. Elias heard the thin, raspy calls of owlets before he ever saw them, a sound so different from their parents' eerie hiss that he almost mistook it for something else entirely. And almost immediately, things began to shift. The strip of field near the tree line, the one the rats had avoided for months, stayed clear. Then a second strip, grain loss at the main storage bin, which Dana had been tracking meticulously in a battered spiral notebook for over a year, dropped noticeably for the first time since the infestation began. It wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was real, and it was measurable, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias let himself feel something close to hope. He didn't say anything to anyone in town. He just kept building more boxes. What happened over the following growing season surprised even Walt Kessler. By early summer, 2 more owl pairs had moved into boxes scattered across the property. Hawks, drawn by the same abundant rodent activity that had once plagued the farm, began appearing more frequently along the fence lines, further thinning the population during daylight hours when the owls slept. Foxes, rarely seen on the property in years past, started showing up at dusk, drawn by the same shifting balance. A local naturalist who came out at Walt's suggestion identified native gopher snakes moving back into the hedgerows, another quiet predator doing its part. The grain bins stayed cleaner. Feed losses kept dropping. Equipment damage, once a monthly expense, became rare enough that Elias almost forgot to budget for it. None of this happened because Elias fought harder. It happened because, for the first time in years, the land had what it needed to balance itself. Walt explained it to him plainly one afternoon, leaning against the fence post nearest the silo. "You didn't beat the rats, Elias. You just stopped getting in nature's way." Elias started noticing things he'd stopped paying attention to years earlier. The fields sounded different at dusk now, fuller, layered with the calls of species he hadn't heard on the property since he was a boy. Dana mentioned one evening that the vegetable stand's customers had started asking about the owls before they asked about the tomatoes, curious about the strange wooden boxes they'd spotted from the road. Meredith kept a small notebook of her own now, separate from her mother's, filled with rough sketches of feathers and pellets and the shapes she saw crossing the darkening sky. It wasn't just fewer rats. It was a farm that felt, for the first time in years, like it was working the way it was supposed to. The same people who had laughed loudest were the first to grow quiet. Roy Callahan, the man who'd joked about birdhouses at the feed store, drove out one afternoon under the pretense of borrowing a tool he didn't really need. He stood by the silo a long while, watching the empty rat traps Elias hadn't bothered replacing in months. "Huh," was all he said. A neighboring farmer named Grant Whitfield showed up a few weeks later, quieter and more curious, asking careful questions about box dimensions and mounting height. He left with a rough sketch Elias drew on the back of a feed receipt, and within a month, 3 new owl boxes appeared along his own fence line. The local farming cooperative sent a representative out to see the results firsthand, and word spread through the county extension office. A group of local school children, Meredith proudly among them, spent a Saturday afternoon helping Elias construct and mount 6 new boxes along the tree line, hammering nails a little crookedly, but grinning the whole time. Elias never once said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. He just kept working, kept building, and let the fields speak for themselves. One full growing season after that first hatch, the transformation was undeniable. Grain bins that had once needed weekly bait refreshes stood clean and untouched. Feed losses, once a steady financial drain, had dropped to a fraction of what they'd been 2 years prior. The equipment shed, once a battleground against chewed wiring, had gone a full season without a single rodent-related repair. The harvest that fall was the best Bramwell fields had produced in over a decade. Dana ran the final numbers twice, not quite trusting them the first time, before finally allowing herself to smile at the kitchen table the way she hadn't in years. Meredith taped a hand-drawn owl to the refrigerator door, right next to the harvest totals, like the two belonged together, which, in a way, they did. Word of the turnaround had spread well beyond Corin's Bend by then. A reporter from the regional paper called to ask about the birdhouse farmer, and Elias found himself laughing at the phrase instead of wincing at it, the way he might have a year earlier. A small gathering formed at the farm one crisp October evening. Neighbors, a few co-op representatives, Walt Kessler leaning on his cane near the silo, Roy Callahan standing quietly at the back of the group. They walked the property together, comparing what they remembered from 2 years before to what stood in front of them now. Full grain bins, healthy standing crops, undamaged storage buildings, and overhead, as the light faded, the silent, gliding shape of a barn owl setting out to hunt. Someone in the small crowd said quietly, almost to themselves, "I guess he wasn't building homes for owls after all." Nobody laughed this time. As the season settled into a new, quieter rhythm, Bramwell Fields began to feel different, not just healthier but somehow more whole. Owls hunted low over the fields at sunset, wide wings catching the last orange light. Meredith took to sitting on the porch steps most evenings, pointing out shapes in the darkening sky to anyone who'd listen. Elias found himself doing the same, coffee in hand, watching land that had once felt like a losing battle finally feel like it was breathing again. Dana's spiral notebook, once filled with grim numbers, now held a different kind of record. Steady harvests, shrinking expenses, a farm slowly climbing back out of the hole it had been sinking into for years. None of it had come from fighting harder or spending more. It had come from restoring something that had quietly gone missing long before the rats ever became a problem. What the town of Corin's Bend had once mocked as a foolish waste of time turned out to be something far bigger than anyone imagined. The slow, patient restoration of a balance the land had lost generations ago. Elias Bramwell never set out to defeat an army of rats. He set out to remember something older and simpler than any trap or poison could offer. That nature, given the smallest chance, often knows exactly how to take care of itself. Sometimes the strongest solution isn't fighting harder, it's restoring what was lost. Have you ever seen nature solve a problem better than chemicals? Would you build owl homes on your own farm? Tell us where you're watching from, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more remarkable farming stories from around the world.